a lot of times one of the biggest practical challenges that people run into when they adopt a vegan diet is, where am I going to get all my protein from without getting 20 grams of carbs for every 8 grams of protein that's coming in? And so to just say, hey, eat more protein is, it circumvents the issue, but not in a way that is easy to apply in a practical way.
Kia ora friends, welcome to the Vegan Body Coach podcast. That was Dr. Eric Trexler, and on today's show, we dive deep into plant protein and amino acids. Is just getting enough daily protein the best recommendation for optimizing your results? Or do we need to dive a little deeper and make our food selections based on specific amino acids? If you want the most out of your plant protein, then this is going to be the episode for you. But first, by way of introduction, and if you're a new listener here, my name is Jackson Burden. I'm a personal trainer, I'm a nutritionist, and a gym owner here in Auckland, New Zealand. And I started this podcast as I was tired of seeing bro science, unscientific claims, and a general lack of nuance taking over the vegan fitness world. If you're truly after evidence-based information from rational experts in various fields, then be sure to hit that subscribe button and make sure you never miss an episode. And on that note, if you haven't already, be sure to take a look back through the catalog of our previous episodes to see if any are of interest to you. I'm super proud of the 38 episodes I've put out so far, and I know the 39th, this episode here with Dr. Eric Trexler, will be no different. So for long-time listeners, welcome back. I know it's been a little bit of a break since I last put out an episode, but welcome back to season 3. I'm going to be smashing out 12 quality episodes for you over the next little while. And all I need from you is a quick review on one of your podcast apps, whether it's Apple or Spotify. Throw up a 5-star review there and help more people find the show. And with that, let's dive in. This is Dr. Eric Trexler on plant protein and optimizing amino acids. Okay, Eric, so I just want to pretty much jump straight into this one with you. And I guess before we do jump into the actual the nitty gritty of the discussion, is maybe you can give a bit of an idea of who you are, what you specialize in, for the listeners who potentially haven't heard of you before.
Sure. Yeah. So my name's Eric Trexler, and I've been focusing on sports nutrition for a while now. I did a master's degree and a PhD where that was kind of my research focus. And sports nutrition, I would kind of define it as nutrition for the purpose of either influencing sport performance, physical performance, or body composition. So, for example, nutritional strategies to build muscle would kind of fall under that umbrella. So academically, that's been a focus of a lot of my research. After finishing up my schooling, I've been working for a company called Stronger by Science, where we do a lot of educational stuff. We do a podcast, articles, books, things like that. We've got a coaching team that I manage there. I also review for the Mass Research Review. I'm one of the co-authors along with Eric Helms, who I know you're familiar with. And we made a nutrition app recently called Macro Factor, where it was kind of fun because all the stuff I've been writing about and talking about on podcasts, we could actually build that into code, and kind of make a product that helps people with their nutrition. So basically, I do a whole bunch of nutrition stuff. And I also, within the last year or two, I can't really remember the timeline with COVID. The time is all just arbitrary.
It's just a blur. Yeah.
But at some point between the time I was born and now, I decided to try out a vegetarian diet. So I do currently consume a vegetarian diet.
Oh, that's so interesting, Eric, because I didn't actually know that when I contacted you, and it's only recently that I was listening to one of your older podcasts on Stronger by Science, and you had mentioned that, and you had some questions from one of your listeners around your transition, which I thought was quite interesting. But that's really cool because I guess up until this point, obviously you were following more of an omnivorous diet, more of a traditional diet, and a lot of the research that has been coming out around plant proteins and their effects on hypertrophy you're potentially looking at a lot of that more through a lens of maybe a more of an unbiased viewpoint, which is really cool because it was, you were following more of a traditional omnivorous diet, potentially. Yeah, I know you're probably including a decent amount of plant proteins as well. But now you've obviously transitioned that way as well. I'd love to ask you the question, Eric, has looking into the research a little bit more on plant proteins factored into you transitioning to a vegetarian diet yourself at all, or has it been more so from another aspect of planetary health or ethical aspects of that transition?
Yeah, so my decision to transition over to a vegetarian diet was more related just to animal welfare. Like
Yeah.
it was pretty straightforward. And so within that context, I pretty much was fine sacrificing some progress. Like I'm not a hyper competitive lifter these days. I've been there, but at this point, I was comfortable saying, you know what, if I'm only getting 80 or 90% of my gains that I'm fighting for, that is, basically a tax I'm willing to pay, a
Mm.
sacrifice that I'm willing to make. But I was really pleasantly surprised over the last maybe 18 months or so. There have been a few really big studies, big in terms of impact and in terms of practical application, but some really impactful studies that have come out over the last 18 months that even though I was comfortable kind of leaving some percentage of my progress on the table because it was worth it to me, I was actually pleasantly surprised to see that, vegetarian and even, completely vegan diets were outperforming what I would have expected based on kind of a mechanistic understanding of proteins and their amino acid composition.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I love to ask this question to some of my friends who are predominantly vegan. Um, and I asked them, hey, look, if you knew that, from this day forth, you would not get any more, gains or results from your training because of your dietary choices, would you continue making those dietary choices? You know what I mean? And because for a lot of us, it is more of an ethical decision, and we would, probably likely stand by that, whether we made gains in the gym or not. But the beautiful thing about this, and what I've been excited about reading your reviews of these studies coming out in regards to plant protein, it's been exciting to see that we don't necessarily have to sacrifice our our productivity in the gym or in training or whatever we like to do. So it's been an exciting time, I guess, for more of the evidence based vegan community as well, who want to understand things on a little bit more nuanced level and understand what the data is saying. So it's been really cool, and your reviews have helped a lot with that. And I'd love to ask you, Eric, like before these studies came out, what was your view of, I guess, plant proteins and their effects in the diet in terms of hypertrophy and strength and those type of outcomes?
That's a good question. And the thing is, since we've been doing the podcast for like close to 3 years now and all the articles and stuff, you can kind of look at my perspectives as like time stamped,
Yeah,
like everything's on the record. So you can kind of
that's right.
trace back and hold me accountable. Um, before I had even really considered dabbling in a plant-based diet, before any of this research came out, by the way, like if you were to ask me 2.5 years ago, what's the deal with plant-based proteins? I would say there's good news and bad news. The good news being you can make equivalent progress on a vegan diet compared to an omnivorous diet. You can use these plant-based proteins and achieve similar outcomes. However, the bad news is it requires more planning and you probably have to eat more total protein. So, up until a couple years ago, a lot of the understanding related to this question was based on a very basic mechanistic understanding of amino acid composition and some very brief acute studies looking at muscle protein synthesis after eating this protein versus that protein.
Mm.
And if you kind of piece together the answers based on that information, which was all we had really until a couple years ago, you would be forgiven for concluding that, this can be a viable approach for someone interested in strength and muscularity. but you probably need to eat more total protein to account for the lower relative quality of these plant-based proteins. And that quality pertains to indices of amino acid composition, but also things like digestibility and absorption kinetics as well. So yeah, if you asked me a couple years ago, that would have been my response is we can make this work, but we have to work a little harder and we probably have to eat more total protein to get the same amount of bang for our buck in terms of building muscle.
Yeah, cool. And I'd love to actually touch on, I guess, the difference, and you alluded to this in your article, the difference between a study that just compares muscle protein synthesis responses to a meal and a study that actually measures longitudinal hypertrophy. But before we dive into that, Eric, maybe for the listeners, because obviously we'll probably have some people that are a little less in the know about, hey, what is actually an amino acid, and maybe when we talk about muscle protein synthesis, what actually is occurring at that point. So maybe we can just define some terms really quickly in terms of, hey, what are essential and non-essential amino acids, and then potentially how does muscle protein synthesis factor into this, and why is it so important for our goals in terms of training?
Yeah. So first off, essential and non-essential, these are terms that apply to amino acids, but they apply to a lot of other things in the diet, right? So we've got essential vitamins and minerals. We've got, we've got essential fatty acids as well as amino acids. And so whenever you see essential in the world of nutrition, what they're really saying is you need to get that from your diet. Your body cannot make it inadequate amounts from just kind of the raw materials floating around. It's something that if you do not seek it out in your diet, your body cannot make sufficient quantities, and that will have an adverse impact on, health and function, basically. So when we talk about essential amino acids, these are amino acids that we do need to seek out from our diet. And then non-essential amino acids, these are amino acids that we can kind of piece together and we can synthesize them as long as we've got adequate raw materials available. As long as the building blocks are around, we can kind of rearrange things and put those together. But essential amino acids are obviously very important. That's why they're called essential. We need to get them from our diet. And this comes into the conversation with protein, because animal-based proteins tend to pretty much across the board be very, very high quality proteins, which means, when we talk about being high versus low quality, a high quality protein has all of the essential amino acids that we need in adequate quantities. So we really have all of our bases covered when we eat something like, milk protein, chicken protein, beef protein. With plant-based proteins, those in many cases will lack at least one of the essential amino acids. And that doesn't mean it lacks it entirely. It means that, the relative amount of it is just too low to be considered suitable. It's lacking sufficient quantities of all of these different essential amino acids. So that's kind of the essential versus non-essential thing and how it factors into protein quality. Was there another term you wanted me to define there? I think muscle protein synthesis.
Yeah, if we can dive into like how, maybe these essential amino acids then play a role in achieving, muscle protein synthesis.
Yeah, absolutely. So, the proteins in our body are constantly turning over, which means they're breaking down, they're getting rebuilt. We're kind of constantly recycling these proteins. And in order to build proteins, we need to have all the raw materials there. And so what happens, within the context of resistance training, for example, just to be, straight to the point, when we lift weights, we do prime our muscles to the anabolic stimulus from protein feeding. And so then we consume some protein, and leucine is a particularly important essential amino acid, because leucine is the amino acid that actually stimulates muscle protein synthesis, which is exactly what it sounds like. This is the process of our muscles synthesizing new proteins to basically build new muscle tissue. So what happens when we consume dietary protein is the leucine stimulates muscle protein synthesis. But in order for that process to continue efficiently and effectively, we need adequate amounts of all of the essential amino acids to be present. And so what that means is if we are exclusively consuming a particular protein source that consistently lacks an essential amino acid, that is something that's going to hinder our ability to build muscle over time. If we are consistently lacking one of these critical building blocks, that's going to be a problem for us in the long run. But one thing that you kind of alluded to previously is we can use some of these studies on muscle protein synthesis, but we should not conflate that with actual hypertrophy or the process of actually building new muscle tissue. So is this a good time to kind of dive into that distinction?
Yeah, I think so, because I guess some of those older studies you had mentioned, they were generally comparing, soy protein with, milk protein, or soy protein with whatever other animal protein, and that's when we saw these potentially lower, I think, effects on muscle protein synthesis from the soy protein. But then,
Yeah.
I guess then we look at the more recent studies and that sort of 12-week, more of a long-term hypertrophy study where we saw comparable results between omnivores and plant eaters. You see a slight different effect. So yeah, I'd love to hear your take on why is it that potentially a single study on a single meal is maybe not going to give us the full picture of long-term changes in muscle mass.
Yeah. So the general paradigm, there are a lot of studies looking at muscle protein synthesis. And like I said, this is the process by which we are synthesizing new muscle proteins. Um, the general paradigm there is to do an intervention, whether it's a resistance training workout or a protein feeding, whatever the case may be. In this context, we're usually saying, here's 30 grams of soy protein, here's 30 grams of whey protein. And the general paradigm is to look at rates of muscle protein synthesis by using some kind of labeled isotopes, little markers, and they look at differences in muscle incorporation of these labeled amino acids. But they're looking at responses over a very short time frame. We're talking about maybe 4, 5, 6 hours, something in that general time frame. And importantly, I mentioned that we're constantly turning these proteins over, we're breaking them down, we're building them up. Muscle protein synthesis is only one side of that equation. So that alone should tell you we have to have some acknowledgement that there's some limitations of using this process and making inferences about long-term gains in actual muscle tissue. So the first part is that muscle protein synthesis is only half of that equation, balancing the process of building up tissues and breaking down, these proteins in tissue as well.
Right.
Another issue is that when we look at resistance training, for example, it's going to heighten our sensitivity to the anabolic effect of protein feeding for a very long time, in many cases upwards of 24, even 48 hours. And so if we are only looking at a time frame of like maybe 4 or 5 hours, you also call into question how effectively that's going to represent the long term, if each workout is kind of sensitizing this process for a very long time frame, and we're only looking at the first little glimpse of it, you have to question whether or not we're really capturing the full effect in those types of studies. And a really fascinating review paper came out just a couple months ago by Whittard and colleagues. And, it was a group of researchers who have done a lot of really good research in muscle protein synthesis. I mean, these are authors who do the original studies with these types of methods. And the paper largely was largely aimed to explain why there's a distinction between protein synthesis and longitudinal hypertrophy over time, because there have been quite a few studies where intuitively you expect muscle protein synthesis, building muscle proteins, that's going to correlate perfectly with muscle growth over time. But there have been multiple studies now showing that the correlation is actually quite poor. And so in this review paper, these authors kind of went into it and said, here's why we study this, here's what we can do with it, but here's what we can't do with it. And what we can't do with it is say, just because this causes greater rates of muscle protein synthesis over 6 hours, I'm going to conclude that over 2 years, that's going to lead to more muscle growth. We can't really make that jump And one of the most eye-opening limitations from my perspective, when you look at this muscle protein synthesis research, is that there are certain conditions that have to be met in order for the muscle protein synthesis response to really even have a chance of telling us a lot about hypertrophy. So if you're looking at muscle protein synthesis and you're measuring over a longer time frame and you're using well-trained participants who are doing a type of exercise that they are very well accustomed to, that maximizes your likelihood that what you're seeing is actually at least somewhat representative of long-term hypertrophy potential.
Right.
But let's look at the opposite of that. If we look at a very untrained person who's doing a very unaccustomed form of exercise, and we're looking at 4 to 6 hours post workout, what we're really seeing there, that muscle protein synthesis process, those rates of protein synthesis are largely going to be tied to just remodeling processes. So not necessarily building brand new proteins that are going to make muscles larger, but just kind of the repair process of like, listen, this muscle's untrained. We're not used to this kind of exercise. We're trying to figure out what the hell just happened and just kind of
Yeah.
like limit the damage and try to, recycle some of this protein.
Yeah.
So the immediate look into that window is really not reflective of long-term hypertrophy, which is why, like I said, you can kind of theorize all day about what these measurements mean and what they don't mean, but the proof is in the pudding. And when we look at the actual, we have plenty of studies that look within a person, was their initial muscle protein synthesis response actually predictive of how much muscle they gained during the study? Time and time again, those correlations tend to be quite poor. And that's really important for this conversation because, like I said, we didn't really have a lot of longitudinal hypertrophy research on vegan diets that had any degree of ecological validity, right?
Mm.
So we weren't really looking at vegan diets that were truly designed to support hypertrophy in the long run. It was just a genuine lack of data. And so when you lack that data, you have to use what is available. And at that point, it was these little glimpses at short-term responses in muscle protein synthesis, largely in untrained people, in conditions that really are not totally reflective of longitudinal hypertrophy potential. So,
Mm.
this was one of those instances where we had to form some kind of conclusion based on the evidence that was available 2 or 3 years ago. And that was really the best you could do. But fortunately, there's been some research in the last couple of years that has said, well, if we're interested in hypertrophy over time, let's measure hypertrophy over time. And so those types of findings have to carry a lot more weight when you're trying to sort through this type of evidence.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting, and I guess maybe we could just sort of dovetail into that particular study. I think it was I can't actually remember Hivia Lorraine et al. I can't quite pronounce that one, but it was last year, and they did have that 12-week study, and both groups consuming 1.6 grams of protein per kilo. And similar responses in terms of muscle growth over that 12-week period. Now, if we go in with the assumption of muscle protein synthesis is somewhat important in the post meal state, I guess this would be a great time to have a look at one of the common suggested methods, I guess, of getting around some of the shortcomings of lower amino acid quality in some of these plant proteins is to just increase your total protein intake to significant amounts. And that's, and you alluded to that before, there's generally been a recommendation that's been seen, and often I think within the plant community as well, it can go, people can go a little too simplistic with it in terms of saying, hey, look, let's just get enough protein, and then that's all they focus on is just enough protein. But I think there can be, especially if you're looking at trying to optimize physique outcomes or strength outcomes, there can be a little more nuance to it that's important. But with this particular study, they were consuming 1.6 grams per kilo, which is tend to be on the lower end of the spectrum for what's recommended for hypertrophy. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the study, and then also why potentially both groups saw similar responses, even though the plant group was, consuming a little bit of a lower protein intake than would be, I guess, expected to see the same comparable outcomes in muscle mass.
Yeah, the study, like you said, I'm kind of going off memory here. It was ages ago that
Yeah,
I
yeah.
dug into it, but one of the reasons that I was really excited about it was before that one, there was a study by Montaigne and colleagues. I'm certain I'm pronouncing that wrong, but they were looking at muscle protein synthesis rates, uh, and what they found was a vegan diet actually was quite comparable to an omnivorous diet as long as protein was high. This was a high protein vegan diet. And you might be saying, well, you just spent like 10 minutes saying who cares about muscle protein synthesis, right?
Right.
But what they did was they looked at muscle protein synthesis over a 72-hour period, if memory serves. It was either 48 or 72 hours. So when we're talking about protein synthesis over days, this is getting closer into some of those conditions where we can actually start to make tentative inferences about hypertrophy over time. So muscle protein synthesis over 48 or 72 hours is quite a different thing than looking at muscle protein synthesis over 6 hours.
Mm.
And so that particular study got me really intrigued, really excited, but it still wasn't that very direct evidence looking at actual hypertrophy. And that's where this study by Javier Lorraine came in. And it was a really excellent study. Like you said, I think it was about 12 weeks, about 1.6 grams per kilogram in each group, divided between 3 or 4 protein servings throughout the day, spread pretty evenly. And they were doing resistance training. And what I really liked about it was, we talk about hypertrophy, but it's easy to say measure hypertrophy, but then the question is how. And so
Right.
sometimes you'll see a study that just does whole body fat-free mass using DEXA, which is a good option, but not a perfect option. And in many cases, it does lack precision to identify small differences between groups or between conditions. But they looked at hypertrophy in many different ways. And they also looked at strength changes as well. So they looked at strength, they looked at DEXA-derived measures of hypertrophy. They also looked at ultrasound measures of hypertrophy. And if memory serves, they might have also looked at the actual fiber level as well with biopsies. But I do recall that they looked at hypertrophy from several different perspectives using some methods that do tend to be quite precise and can detect relatively small differences between groups. And as we've mentioned, their findings were quite positive for people who are interested in more of a plant-based diet, because within those conditions where you've got at least 1.6 grams per kilogram per day of total protein, you're dividing that across at least 3 or 4 meals. And each of those meals is delivering plenty of leucine, plenty of essential amino acids. Within those conditions, it looks like these diets are fairly interchangeable in terms of accumulating strength gains and muscle gains over time. Now, you mentioned uh, the strategy of just saying, "Hey, let's have more protein," as kind of a way to get around some of the shortcomings of individual protein sources on a vegan diet. And generally speaking, I do think that that's a sensible. I think it's a way to do it that does effectively circumvent some of the potential shortcomings of these protein sources. But as many listeners will probably attest to, um, it's not the most practical advice, right?
Mm.
So if you are on a plant-based or totally vegan diet and you're interested in building muscle, but you're also interested in keeping your calorie intake low enough that you're not gaining unwanted amounts of body fat in the process, it can be really hard to say, oh, just eat way more protein. And I mean, on a vegan diet, finding lowish calorie protein sources is already hard enough.
Mm.
Like a lot of times, one of the biggest practical challenges that people run into when they adopt a vegan diet is, where am I going to get all my protein from without getting 20 grams of carbs for every 8 grams of protein that's coming in?
Right.
And so to just say, hey, eat more protein is, it circumvents the issue, but not in a way that is easy to apply in a practical way. Finding those really high doses of protein is kind of why we're in this predicament in the first place, right? We're trying to seek out ways to make this a practical, easy to implement high protein diet that just so happens to be vegan. So there are challenges, and so I think one of the things that is really useful about this kind of pair of studies that's been done recently is it gives us an idea of, when you say high, how high are we talking? How high do we really have to go in order to make these meals maximally or near maximally effective for supporting muscle growth? And it looks like we don't have to go that far out of our way. And so I don't think that these studies completely invalidate the idea that, you might want to go a little higher per meal with a vegan diet versus omnivorous within certain intake ranges. I think that's still probably true. But the question is, at what point is our protein intake high enough that we have effectively taken care of this issue?
Mm.
And I think that threshold's lower than we expect. So if you told me, I insist that I am going to eat 1 gram per kilogram per day of protein, I'm not willing to budge on that. And I want to support hypertrophy to the maximal degree possible. In that case, I would say you probably want to go out of your way to make sure you're eating some very high quality proteins. If we're leaving the total protein intake at a set value that is below the optimal range, I think in those circumstances, protein quality at the individual source level might become more of a pertinent challenge to work through. But what's really nice about this series of studies is that, based on the evidence we have available now, and I'm certain people are going to, in the future, try to replicate these findings and make sure that they hold up. But for now, the evidence would suggest we actually take care of this without needing enormous doses of plant protein. So if we're getting that 1.6, which, like you said, has largely been considered the lower end of the optimal range for muscle building purposes, if we're getting that every day and dividing that into 3, 4, maybe 5 equal sized protein servings throughout the day, it looks like that's probably going to cover our bases to basically an optimal degree. Within that context, we don't have to do too much more to, we don't have to put too much more effort into planning out our protein doses. One thing that is worth considering is, over the course of the full day, looking at your amino acid coverage and using something like a complementary protein pairing strategy. I think that is a nice way to, you can argue the contexts in which that's critically important and the degree to which it matters. But if you're on a vegan diet or a heavily plant-based diet, and you're very interested in maximizing muscle growth or muscle retention, I do think that there's some value in exploring complementary strategies for protein pairings.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point to bring up, Eric, is the idea of complementary proteins. Like, I guess the idea around combining 2 different proteins in a single meal, or more than 2, is to sort of even out some of those shortcomings in single protein amino acid quality, and of course, in order to achieve, as we alluded to before, in order to achieve a significant muscle protein synthesis per meal, we need to achieve a certain amount of leucine per meal. So I guess, first of all, the question for you is, how important do you feel hitting that certain amount of leucine per meal is for achieving these similar outcomes that we see in the study, where they consumed, a decent amount of protein, and they, they divided those up into 3 to 4 meals per day, and they did resistance training. How important do you think, within that particular study, hitting leucine per meal was for those outcomes?
Well, I think it's best practice, from my perspective, to try to get at least 2 grams of leucine per meal. if you can. I think we don't have, from my perspective, a totally conclusive idea of exactly how much leucine per meal we actually need for maximizing hypertrophy over time. Most people will estimate somewhere in the 2 to 3 gram range. I think looking at the longitudinal evidence, 2 seems to do pretty well. And I think one of the reasons that it's a little bit lower than people have anticipated is because, like I said, resistance training sensitizes our muscles to the anabolic response to dietary protein. And so, I know a lot of people who really are adamant, you got to get 3 grams of leucine per meal. You got to get 3 grams.
Mm.
I think that they might be underestimating the anabolic stimulus that's independently coming from resistance training, which does persist, like I said, in many cases, 24, 48 hours, and sometimes even longer, depending on your training status and the exact training stimulus that was applied. So
Right.
I think there's no downside and plenty of potential upside for shooting for at least 2 grams of leucine per meal. Mechanistically, it makes sense. Longitudinally, it kind of fits well with some of the studies we've mentioned previously. I know at least one of those studies had a meal by meal breakdown, and both groups were getting at least 2 grams of leucine per meal. So I think that is definitely best practice.
Mm.
And fortunately, you don't have to work too hard to go and find 2 grams of leucine per meal if you're already hitting the type of protein intake that we're talking about. If you're in the 1.6, 1.8 grams per kilogram per day, even higher, and you are dividing that into, like I said, 3 or 4 meals a day, the leucine is most likely going to be taken care of.
Mm. And generally, I mean, that would equate to, I guess, if someone, say someone is consuming, 140 grams of protein per day, and they split that up into 3 or 4 meals, they're going to be consuming, 30, 40 grams of protein per meal. And if we're consuming that from a couple of different protein sources in that meal, they're likely going to be covering their bases. But I think probably where people can go wrong in this particular scenario is, and this is me looking at some of those tables that you had referenced in regards to, I think it was via another article, but in regards to like the total amount of protein needed to be consumed via different protein sources in order to achieve, so 2.7 grams of leucine per meal. And if you're consuming just a single protein source, so say if someone was just consuming a meal of solely wheat protein, they or solely potato protein or solely pea protein, they'll need to consume different amounts of total protein to achieve that leucine dose. And it becomes very, very difficult to achieve a significant amount of leucine if you're consuming solely wheat protein in a meal, because you have to consume a heck of a lot of, or for probably a better example, oat protein. You'd have to consume, I think it was something between like 250 to 300 grams of oats to achieve your, your leucine threshold for that meal. And so, good luck to anyone consuming that amount of oats, So I think there's where the sort of the practical implications come in, and where potentially, using some, if you are consuming maybe a lower leucine protein or a lower total quality protein, you may want to bump that meal up with another complementary protein that maybe is a higher quality protein source. Would you say that's an accurate description of a good sort of practical way of looking at it?
Yeah, and I think when it comes to complementary proteins, there's kind of two factors to consider. And so one, which you've alluded to, is when I look at the composition of this entire meal, am I getting a decent amount of leucine in? And like I said, I think 2 grams is a nice number to shoot for. That's the first consideration. And yeah, I think you probably, it's not a bad idea to just look at, what are my main protein sources? Are they unusually low in leucine? And if so, maybe I have to give some consideration to work some higher leucine sources into my diet. That's the one component. And that would be on a per meal basis, theoretically speaking. When it comes to essential amino acid coverage, like I said, a lot of plant-based protein sources will lack one or more of the essential amino acids. And by lack, I don't mean a complete lack. It's just not an adequate amount relative to the protein dose. And so a big point of debate is within a single meal, do you really need to have complete complementary coverage of those essential amino acids? Or are we more so talking about just throughout the day? I think leucine is probably more pertinent on a per meal basis. And I think the essential amino acids, like, it's not a bad idea to get some nice essential amino acid coverage on a per meal basis. I think complementary protein matching is, again, it's kind of a best practice, better safe than sorry type of strategy. But I don't know if I'm convinced that it is extremely critical. So first meal of the day, maybe, but then we start talking about you have breakfast at 8 a.m. and then you have lunch at noon. Uh, and the question is, are all of those amino acids from breakfast at 8 a.m., are they just vanished, completely gone?
Right.
And the answer is no. I mean, digestion, absorption, and clearance of amino acids from the bloodstream, this is something that takes place over fairly long time spans. And so I'm not really convinced that beyond, I think maybe the first meal of the day, you might have special attention on that, and then you consider, when your last meal was, that might be pertinent from the night before. But, on a meal by meal basis, especially later meals in the day, I'm not super convinced that you need to have perfect essential amino acid coverage in every single individual meal. But it certainly is not a bad strategy. At that point, it's kind of like, we've got a series of priorities in decreasing order of importance, right? And so the first priority is, are you getting enough total protein throughout the day? That's number one. Second, we've got, okay, are you dividing that up sensibly? And I would say, 3 or 4 meals throughout the day, kind of spaced relatively equally, at least a few hours between meals. First thing, total protein. Second thing, how is it distributed? 3 or 4 equal sized meals throughout the day. Then you start getting into things like, am I having enough leucine per meal? That would be kind of the third. And again, this is in decreasing order of importance. That'd be the third factor to consider. And then I would say fourth, even after that, would be maybe at each meal, I take a look and make sure I don't have any glaring, you know, shortcomings in terms of essential amino acid profile. But I do expect that to some degree, we can kind of borrow some of those essential amino acids from previous meals to an extent that would enable continued synthesis of new muscle proteins.
I did want to touch on branched chain amino acid use in terms of the supplement. I know that that's come up as an option for people potentially if they're really focused on, look, I really want to maximize this meal's leucine dose and I am using a lower quality protein in this meal. Could I just supplement with a branched chain amino acid at the same time, while I'm eating this meal and really maximize the response? I guess it would be the same as combining proteins. But I think in reality, I guess a lot of these discussions come from the idea that someone is consuming like a very low amount of variety of proteins throughout the day. But in reality, people that's not how people eat. People eat a variety of different foods throughout the day, and generally, well, at least clients that I work with, we're trying to diversify our meals as much as possible. And you'll probably have your top 3 main proteins that you'll include throughout a day, and you'll sort of recycle those throughout the day. But still, you're getting probably a large diversity of different amino acids throughout the day, and that will probably be covering your bases. So I guess how much weight or stock would you put in using a branched chain amino acid to, I guess, bump up the essential amino acid quality of a particular meal?
So, branched chain amino acids are really fascinating because we know that they have a very important role in the body, but I believe they've received a disproportionate amount of interest as a supplementation target. And the reason I say that is because, we really would have one of two priorities for this strategy, right? So, if we're supplementing amino acids in the interest of muscle building, it's usually one of two things. We're either concerned that we're not getting enough leucine to initiate the process of muscle protein synthesis. And if that is the main concern, I personally would supplement with leucine itself.
Right.
And I have seen some evidence that that might be the way to go. Um, I don't think it's going to do anything for you if you're getting that. If you're pretty consistently getting around that 2 gram per meal target, I don't think you're going to benefit from it. But if it's something you're struggling with, kind of getting to that 2 gram per meal range, then yeah, maybe some leucine supplementation would help with that. The other potential outcome we're trying to achieve there is getting essential amino acid coverage. And I would say that more often than not, it is not going to be one of the branch chain amino acids that we're lacking. I would say it's probably more likely to be something like lysine or methionine.
Right.
And so your branch chain amino acid supplement is not going to help with that because
Mm.
it's not going to contain either of those. So I would actually, if I were going to have an amino acid supplement in my toolkit as a plant-based dieter, it would either be leucine, probably not, or essential amino acids. So they do sell supplements that contain all the essential amino acids. I think that is the most defensible supplementation candidate for these types of applications.
Mm.
I personally don't use essential amino acid supplements because I know that I have my bases covered in terms of my amino acid coverage. But I do think that that is a defensible and intuitive option if you're struggling with getting enough coverage with your amino acids.
Yeah, and I guess for a lot of people, that likely shouldn't be the case unless under really, really rare circumstances. And I say that because I think majority of people will be consuming some decent quality proteins throughout the day that are going to be achieving that sort of leucine threshold dose per meal. But I guess to kind of round this one out and to give some take homes to people that are, the people that are probably listening, a lot of them will have already been, ticking off their daily protein. All right, they're getting 1.6 to 1.8 grams per kilo. They're doing that on a consistent basis. That's all fine. They're very consistent with that. And they're spreading that over multiple meals per day because that's just their lifestyle. They eat a breakfast, a lunch, a dinner. They might have a protein shake after a training session or whatever. So they're getting that kind of distribution under control there. But then for the people that maybe really want to dive deeper and nuance and really optimize their response to training by trying to optimize the MPS response to a meal and really achieve that leucine dose per meal. What would you recommend from your own experience, even through your transition to vegetarianism and through your assessment of the data? What would be some sort of top quality proteins that would help them achieve that leucine threshold that they could potentially include in their meals on a more regular basis, and that way they can take away some proteins to focus on, and then maybe they can sort of decide, hey, look, or maybe I'll include less of this protein and more of this protein going forward.
Yeah, I mean, the one that comes to mind, the kind of classic example of a really high quality vegan protein is soy protein. I personally do consume a decent amount of soy protein through soy isolate, kind of supplement products, through soy crumbles, through tofu. Soy is a really nice protein source. Another one that comes to mind that isn't quite as good as soy, but is still a pretty good, well-rounded protein source would be mycoprotein. It's a pretty good option, often sold under the brand name Corn with a Q.
Mhm.
Um, I do. So these aren't going to work for vegan applications, but if you're like me and you got
Mm-hmm.
into vegetarian diets because of concerns related to animal welfare, you might be able to think outside the box a little bit. So, like, for example, I eat eggs, um, but I get my eggs from an animal rescue. And
Mm.
so, like, what they do is they go and they rescue the chickens from, really bad living conditions, and they take care of them. The chickens are like having the time of their life there. It is an animal rescue that is purely focused on the wellness of the animals. But the chickens are going to lay the eggs either way, right? And
Yeah.
so they sell the chicken eggs, and then they use the proceeds to feed the cats and the dogs and the cows. And they say that the chickens donate their eggs to kind of pay rent on the animal rescue.
That's
So
really
like
cool.
I eat those eggs, and I know that for a lot of people who eat a vegan diet, that that crosses a line, and I certainly respect that. But from my perspective, that's a way that I'm like getting a really high quality protein source, but really feeling okay with the ethics behind how the animals are treated and things like that. Another thing that some people will disagree with for sure, but I've looked into it. I've tried to contact as many people as I could with inside knowledge on this. A lot of the whey protein supplements that you do find on the market, the whey is coming from cheese manufacturers and manufacturers of conventional dairy products. And if you talk to anyone who works in that sector of creating conventional dairy products, getting rid of whey is actually a bit of a problem. It is difficult to get anyone to take it from you. Whey obviously is kind of this leftover byproduct of the cheese making process.
Right.
And so there are a lot of small time cheesemakers who one of their biggest operational concerns is I am unable to get rid of my whey and I can't dump it because it's bad for the environment and I can't feed too much of it to the animals because it doesn't really work for their diets. And so from my perspective, I've kind of become okay with consuming some whey products because I haven't been able to find any convincing evidence that it really provides an upward pressure on dairy production. I feel like that whey is going to exist and be either discarded in the environment or made into supplements. It's usually just what's left over after they make all the conventional dairy products. So,
Right.
there are some places where you can kind of look into the actual source of the protein and decide for you based on, your ethical reasons for adopting the diet, whether or not that kind of fits, your perspective. And I completely agree, or I completely, respect
Mm.
opposing viewpoints who might say, no, I'm not okay with that egg justification or the whey justification. I totally get that and
Totally.
respect it. But for just straight down the line vegan, uh, like I said, soy, mycoprotein, and there's never been a better time to be on a plant based diet because right now there are quite a few companies that are coming out with more and more plant-based protein blends. So, yeah, you see a lot more of companies that are putting out these protein products that are blends of multiple different plant-based proteins. So, like you'll see pea plus a couple other things, pea and pumpkin seeds and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Really nice mixtures where they're taking care of a lot of that extra work for you,
Mm.
So instead of you having to go out and say, how am I going to put together some complementary protein sources here? They say, yeah, we're going to take a little bit of, I've seen some really creative blends of pea and coconut protein and pumpkin seed protein where they blend it all together into a really nice blend, a really nice product. So if you're dedicated to sticking, with a purely, vegan approach to the diet, soy, mycoprotein, and some of those plant-based blends. Those are kind of where I would start.
Yeah, and I agree. There's so many products coming out now, and we have a few over this side of the world that have that are pea protein based in terms of like a meat substitute, and
Mm-hmm.
they're really high protein, low calorie density, great options for people in a calorie deficit who are really struggling to hit those higher protein options, while keeping to a calorie target. And so that and pea, and do you think pea is decent protein as well in terms of quality? Have you looked much into pea protein?
I haven't looked into it too much. I think it's pretty solid. I'm not certain exactly how the amino acid profile looks off the top of my head. But I do see that there are a lot of pea. I actually have a pea based product that I do consume as like a ready to drink beverage, and because I know that with all my other protein sources, it's good enough to be one of my protein sources. I don't worry too much about that. So pea, I think, is a pretty solid option, especially in the context of a diverse diet with a lot of different protein
Yeah.
sources. And I do see that pea is often the base of a lot of those
Mm,
blends I mentioned, where they're doing pea plus a bunch of other
that's
stuff.
right.
So
Yeah.
most of those blends, they're going to start with something like pea or something like rice protein, and then kind of build from there.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly. I mean, a lot of the pea protein powders that I recommend are a pea and rice blend because I know pea protein is, I think, lower in methionine, and then the rice protein is higher, and then it kind of has this complementary sort of um, effect on that. And also, when you combine pea and rice together, you get this incredible leucine total as well, which is more similar to whey. So I think that's a really good option for people in terms of like a shake. But then also, what I'm excited to see in the future, Eric, is the development of corn as in maize proteins and potato proteins, and how we can hopefully companies will start to use the concentrated forms of those products in maybe meat substitutes and things like that, because of the amino acid profile of specifically of corn is really high in leucine, which I had no idea about until looking at these tables.
Yeah.
And high, like basically, if I'm looking at right here, even as this was leucine per 100 grams for corn is 8.8 and whey is 8.6. So, it's even higher than whey protein.
Yeah.
And then and then potato on the other hand, also really high leucine 6.7, but also has um, a a large or a high amount of all the essential amino acids within that protein as well. So I'm excited to see, in the future what companies do with those two proteins, because I think they could really make an impact on the sort of the protein supply industry, specifically coming from vegetable sources. So that's quite exciting too.
Yeah, and the nice thing, you just kind of think back at some of the things we've mentioned, some of these protein sources. We're talking about peas, we're talking about wheat, corn, potato. I like chickpeas a lot. I like lentils a lot. All different types of seeds and grains. I mean, these are not food sources that are difficult to kind of source in your diet. These are really easy to seek out, and so when it comes to a whole food diet, you can see that it's not super hard to put together a diet that kind of covers your bases for essential amino acids. And then, like you said, the opportunities I mentioned previously, there's just never been a better time to be on a
Mm,
plant-based diet. There's enough interest now, kind of collectively, that you see the companies making these really creative blends of different plant-based proteins. That's only going to accelerate in the years that follow, which is really exciting. Even if you're not on a totally plant-based diet, there's so much more interest collectively in adopting plant-based diets, or even just kind of making some swaps and going into from a kind of traditional omnivorous diet to a more plant-based but still omnivorous diet. And so companies are kind of picking up on that demand, and I do expect over the next few years we're going to see better and better products. And I mean, as someone who spent most of their early years lifting on an omnivorous diet, I mean, did you ever have a whey protein shake before like 2005?
I oh no, because I was still would have been in high school, so I kind of came into whey protein when it was like all tasting like milkshakes, and it was just incredible.
Yeah. So I got into lifting when I was 12,
Right.
and
Okay.
like begged my parents to let me go try a protein shake. Let me go get some protein powder. Whey protein in the early 2000s was awful. I mean, I can't even imagine how bad it was in like the 80s and 90s.
Yeah.
But even in the early 2000s, it was really terrible. The texture was bad. It was kind of like bitter, uh, chalky, didn't mix well. It was really, really bad. And then you just go like 5 or 10 years later, and it's a completely different world. I mean, the formulations they just took off and they got so good. The palatability, the mouthfeel, the texture, the mixability, the flavor profile, they just did magic, you know? And so I'm really excited to see. Right now, a lot of people say these plant-based protein mixes, the powders and stuff and the ready-to-drink beverages, people say, yeah, the flavor isn't very good. Part of me wonders how much of that is, strictly due to the protein sources being used. And part of me
Mm,
wonders if they just need a few years to tinker with it. Because
yeah.
after seeing, how far whey protein came in such a short period of time, I'm really optimistic that some of these plant-based products are going to be really palatable within the next few years. And they already are from my perspective, but
Yeah.
I do think that there's room to grow, and I think that growth will happen.
Yeah, I think there is a few things to that. Like I know that when I was working in a supplement store, and this was the early days of when pea protein was coming about, and there was a product that we were getting in there, and I wasn't vegan at the time, and I remember this pea protein just being horrendous, but people were buying it, But I think it almost was going. They were going, number one, probably as early days of protein formulation for plant based protein, so the flavor profile probably wasn't quite there. But at the same time, maybe a lot of these companies are also sort of trying to target that more kind of organic, natural flavorings and things like that, where they kind of miss out on the market that are coming over from a whey protein and are expecting something uh, a lot more flavorsome. And I know that when I first tried a pea protein, after drinking whey protein for so many years, I just couldn't finish the shake. It was just so bad. But now that I've completely removed those really hyper palatable whey protein shakes and I only consume a pea and rice protein shake, my palate has changed to some extent, and now I enjoy those. At the same time, I'll say that the products that we're getting over here now and the companies that are producing these plant protein shakes, the flavorings are just getting really, really, really good. So, like you were saying, it just takes time, and I think it's only a matter of time before the flavor profiles are really comparable with some of the whey proteins out there.
Yeah, definitely.
So to finish this one up here, Eric, I'd love for you maybe just to wrap it up with a quick summary of maybe the key characteristics of what the listeners need to focus on from a protein dietary perspective in regards to optimizing their responses to training.
Yeah, I would say, top priority, make sure you're getting enough protein, ideally about 1.6 grams per kilogram per day. Obviously, that number is going to vary if you're extremely lean or if you have, extra body fat. If you're on any extreme of the body fat percentage spectrum, then that number is going to become less applicable, right? So I usually tell lifters 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kilogram of total body weight, or somewhere between 2 to 2.75 grams per kilogram of fat free mass. So
Okay.
just lean body mass. So that's the top priority. Second priority, distribute that protein throughout the day into preferably like 3 or 4 equal sized protein servings. If you, I think we got a little tornado warning going around here.
Oh wow.
Um, but
Okay.
yeah, it's spring. We get those around here.
That's a regular, is it?
I don't know if could you hear the little
I
alarm
could hear
thing?
that. Yeah.
Yeah. But anyway, yeah. So 3 or 4 relatively equal sized meals, that would be the way to do it. You want to make sure that you're incorporating some relatively high quality proteins if you can, something that's soy based or a nice mixture, like you said, of like, a pea based or, pea and rice kind of blend. So either seeking out high quality protein sources or being a little more mindful of getting those complementary protein sources that kind of make up for each other's shortcomings in terms of amino acid profile. And, again, if possible, trying to shoot for that 2 grams of leucine per meal. That would be a nice way to do it.
That's awesome. That's a great round out there, Eric. And I appreciate you coming on and discussing all of that with us. And I know the listeners will want to dive deep into this one and hopefully have some great takeaways from it to implement. I wanted to give you the floor, mate, just to plug some of this stuff that's going on. What are you working on for the rest of the year, and anything you want to let the listeners know about what you guys are doing over at Stronger by Science or at Macrofactor.
Sure. Yeah. First of all, I really appreciate the opportunity. It was a pleasure to be here and to speak with you. I'll be staying busy this year with Stronger by Science, the articles, the podcasts. The Mass Research Review is our monthly research review. If you happen to subscribe, you would have heard about all this stuff. 6 months, maybe a year ago. So Mass Research Review is always keeping us busy. Stronger by Science, and like you said, Macrofactor is a diet app where it's a really, really efficient tracking tool for your nutrition. One thing that's really exciting for people on plant-based diets is that it doesn't just track calories, protein, carbs, fats. You can also look at fiber. You can look at your amino acid totals throughout the day as well. So you can look per meal or per day and figure out what your leucine intake is looking like, what your methionine intake is looking like. So there's a lot of utility there. And if you go on the coached mode, it'll also give you targets based on your goal and based on your progress. So it'll kind of continue adjusting, how many calories you should be shooting for each day, how much carbohydrate, fat, and protein. It's completely compatible with a plant-based diet, and it updates according to your progress and according to your goals. So mainly I'll be staying busy with all those different projects over the next year or so. And if you want to check out any of that stuff, you can find all of it over at strongerbyscience.com. And if you want to stay in touch with me, you can find me mostly on Instagram, and my handle is @Trexler Fitness.
Brilliant, man. Well, I love your work, Eric, and we'll definitely link those ones in the description for the listeners. Thanks again for coming on, man. It's been insightful. It's been really enjoyable chatting to you.
Yeah, thanks so much.
And there we have it, guys. A deep dive into understanding the nuance of research on muscle protein synthesis, an overview of some of the recent studies on plant-based diets and muscle growth, and some practical takeaways on what you should actually be doing when it comes to choosing what proteins to eat. I hope you enjoyed it. Hopefully it was helpful for you. I really enjoyed that discussion, and I absolutely love Dr. Eric Trexler's work as well. Of course, get in touch with him, check out his work, the Macrofactor Diet app, and if you're a geek like me, sign up to the Mass Research Review. There's always at least 10 tabs open on my laptop with articles to read from Mass, so I will vouch for them and say that it's well worth the investment if you're a coach or just someone wanting to dive a little deeper into the science of training and nutrition. Now, I get it, designing the right diet that hits adequate calories for your goal, daily protein targets, and smart protein selection doesn't actually sound that simple, but it really can be. And I've recently updated my 8-week vegan fat loss mastery course with 20 plus presentations on all you need to know about plant-based fat loss, including a presentation purely on plant protein. I guide you through the whole process and ensure you are meeting your daily targets to fast track your results. The Fat Loss Mastery course comes alongside my online coaching services, now available over at veganbody.coach. And if you're after a muscle gain plan or a fat loss plan, I've got you covered too. So guys, I'll throw the link in the description if you think having someone in your corner for the next little while might be a good move for you. And with that, that's about as much of a sales pitch you'll ever get from me. Let's wrap this one up. Don't be a stranger. Hit me up on IG. Comment on my stories of my boy Trooper. Heart eyes are always welcome. And be sure to throw a quick star rating on Apple or Spotify or any of the apps that you listen to help the podcast reach more people. It's always greatly appreciated, and makes this whole thing much more worthwhile. And with that, I hope you enjoy the first episode of season 3. I've got 12 episodes planned for this particular season, so keep an eye on whatever podcast app you listen to. Keep an eye on the IG. And of course, if you have any topics you want covered or guests you'd love to see on the show, always love hearing recommendations or suggestions from you as well. I'll leave it there. We'll see you in the next episode, Plant Friends.